to. This ruling came out on Wednesday evening, I believe, last week. And so we quickly worked through it and are already looking into a number of our clients to see how we can help them as well. So really today we're predominantly going to focus on the changes that occurred with this new ruling, and then also talk through how we can help clients, or how you can really lead your own assessment and audit and looking at your staff. I'm going to go ahead and record. Unless, do you have it, Chase?
It's recording.
All right. Again, Kendra Bryant, I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Hanna Resource Group, and compensation is near and dear to my heart. I've worked with a lot of companies across Kentucky, but also across the nation, and looking at the impact that DOL and FLSA has on their employees. And so excited to share with you today about some of the recent changes. And I am joined by Andrea Bevan. Andrea is our Director of Compensation. She's phenomenal. She has a past background at larger organizations like Yum Brands and Papa John's, Transamerica, but also served at Mercer for quite some time. And she's been leading our compensation practice now for several years. Andrea is partnering with a number of clients that are on retained comp contracts with us, and as soon as this ruling came through, she's got thousands of employees that this impacts as well. So quick overview. So FLSA, or the Fair Labor Standards Act, a lot of people don't realize it's a 1938 law. So this one dates back quite some time. And what it does is it includes white collar exemptions from overtime. So there are two key terms that you're going to hear a lot in this webinar today. One of them is non-exempt. So non-exempt means that you are not exempt from this particular law, and that particular employee must be paid overtime for their work. So time and a half for any hours worked over 40 in Kentucky. You're also going to hear exempt a lot. Exempt means that under the law, they're exempt from the overtime requirement, and that you do not have to pay overtime for that particular law. So there are a number of exemptions that a job needs to meet, not just necessarily a salary level. And we'll walk through each of those quickly today. There's an executive, administrative, professionals, computers, and outside sales exemptions. So when you're looking at a particular employee, it's actually by employee, not even necessarily by job. When you look by employee and you test that particular employee for exemption, there's three different things that they typically have to meet. One of them is a salary level. So are they paid enough? And that is exactly what just changed, and we'll talk through what those changes mean. One of them is, are they paid on a salary basis? So what that says is that you're not necessarily paying them hours for every hour that they work, but instead you're paying them for a job in a particular work week. And so you can't typically make deductions if they were to work less than 40 hours within that particular work week. And then the third characteristic is the duties test. And the duties vary based upon the type of job, and it could be everything from, do they manage 2 or more employees? Do they have significant independent decision and judgment in creating policies and procedures on behalf of your organization? Are they a lawyer? Whatever, we'll walk through those in a minute. But there are three different levels, and they have to meet all 3 of those in order for that role to be exempt. So you might have this new ruling that came through and says, hey, we've increased the salary threshold. So currently, in order to be exempt, a part of that test is the salary threshold. You must make currently $684 per week in order to be considered exempt. What this new ruling brings in is a increase to that minimum salary threshold. So beginning July 1st, which is going to be here before you know it, our employees have to make $844 per week as a part of that exemption criteria to be considered exempt. And then moving on to January 1st of 2025, that actually jumps all the way to $1,128 per week. So it's a pretty significant increase. So if you look at it currently, exempt employees have to make on an annual basis, annualized $35,568. That's jumping all the way up to 58,656. So it's pretty substantial. You might wonder where the DOL came up with this number. And it's actually the 35th percentile of all salaried paid workers in the lowest wage census area. We'll say that again. It's the 35th percentile. So everybody who's exempt right now, who's classified as a salary, it's the 35th percentile in that lowest wage census area. As a part of this regulation too, they're actually also relooking at this every 3 years. So every 3 years, they're going to make an update and they're going to, I believe, use that same criteria. So 35th percentile lowest wage census area, census region. So it's going to be something that we have to keep up with on a continual basis. So one other big change to this, we don't see a ton of employers that are using this highly comped employee, but there is a special call out as well for employees who are highly compensated. This is actually set at the 85th percentile, and it currently is 107,432. So if you're at 107,432, you're typically considered exempt as long as you meet one of the exemption criteria in the duties test. It's the regulations aren't as tight there. And then moving to January, it's 151, 164. And again, we don't have a ton of employees who are using this highly comped employee threshold. Typically, if we have a highly comped employees, they're also meeting the duties of the standard duties test too. But I did want to call this out. Let's dive into these exemption criteria. Again, there's 3 different ones. I'm going to go back here really quick. So the salary level, that's what we just talked about. So that's the minimum salary threshold. Then you've got the salary basis. So are they paid a salary? And they're paid as the same standard salary every single week. And then the third is the duties test. And the duties test falls into a number of different categories. And so I thought it would be helpful to walk through these really quickly because we have a number of employers that we've partnered with that have a few that might be on the cusp and they're not sure is this job exempt or non-exempt, but they haven't pulled the trigger yet to really do an in-depth analysis, knowing that this change was coming out, but also knowing that it might have a significant impact on their workforce. But of any time, now's the time to do it because you're likely going to have to be doing a full analysis of your entire workforce. So now's a good time to say, as a part of this new law, as a part of this new regulation that's come into place, we're analyzing our entire workforce. And because of that, these jobs are now non-exempt. So if any time to do it, now's the time to take a look at it. So let's walk through some of the exemption categories as well, because you may have some jobs that do meet the new salary threshold, but still don't meet the duties test. The first one is the executive exemption. So obviously compensated on a salary basis at the threshold that we talked about, but these folks are going to be managing 2 or more full-time equivalents. So, and when we say managing, can they hire, can they fire? Can they promote people? Can they make recommendations for any of these that are given what the law calls as particular weight, but do they have the autonomy and authority to really hire and fire employees? Promotions, advancement, recommendations for those kinds of things. The second one, and this is the one that we see the most of, but also, in my opinion, is one of the most vague of the exemptions that we have, and this is the administrative exemption. So again, compensated on a salary basis, their primary duty has to be directly related to the management of the general business operations of the employer or the employee's customer. So that's just IT, finance, HR, marketing, or doing some work on behalf of the employee's customers. But this is the last part that trips a lot of folks up. Their primary duty has to include the exercise of independent discretion and judgment with matters of significance. What exactly does that mean? It typically means, do they have the authority to waive or deviate from established policies? Do you have established policies already, and can they say, hey, in this case, this does or does not apply? Are they able to create policies and procedures? Are they able to really make recommendations that have some significant weight on the business. So would the business have a huge financial loss or shortfall because of that decision? It gets pretty complicated, so happy to chat through if you have any specific questions here. But this is basically saying, can they, on their own, using their own independent discretion and judgment, make decisions on behalf of the business rather than just applying an established technique, an established procedure already. So not necessarily just going through a checklist of the company told me to do X, Y, and Z in this particular order, but I'm going to deviate from that because I have the authority to do so. And again, this is probably the most used exemption that we see in most of our clients is this administrative. The next one would be the learned professional exemption. So this is your standard doctor, lawyer, anybody in the education field. So again, it's compensated on a salary basis, and they have to have an advanced degree in a field of science or learning. So these are pretty standard. Your next one is your creative professional. So again, compensated at the minimum salary threshold, but these would be artists or authors or those that are truly creating work. Graphic designers might fall under this creative professional exemption. Right. And then the computer exemption. So compensated on a salary basis again. These are folks who are creating code, creating software, creating applications. So not help desk people, not folks who are following standardized procedures, but those that are truly designing, analyzing, creating, testing in an IT space. They're truly modifying programs. And this last one actually wasn't affected at all by the new ruling. So this would be your outside sales exemption. These are folks who do not have a minimum salary requirement. So they do not have that minimum salary threshold, but these are truly outside sales jobs. So are they going away from the business, obtaining orders and contracts for sales? And when we say outside, we mean truly going to the customer to truly make sales. So those folks who are your call center representatives that might be calling for orders or calling to find leads, those are inside sales jobs. Those would not be covered under this exemption. These are only those account executive type roles who are truly stepping outside of the business and going door to door to find sales. And again, these typically a lot of times are paid commission and are not subject to that salary requirement. As we walk through these, feel free to throw any questions in the chat as we go, and I am happy to answer anything if you've got questions related to these. Andrea, I'll kick it to you from here.
Okay, so we did have, this. We're scheduled in July to have this change on the salary requirement. Again, we said we should go through and look and see on these other exemptions to make sure that everything meets the test. And then we can go through and say, what do we want to do with this increased salary to see whether our employees will stay in the exempt status or maybe need to be reclassified for non-exempt. So again, first the test, make sure you're looking at each one on all the different tests that Andrew just went over. And then look and see who's impacted by this minimum salary threshold. And it is in 2 stages, right? So you're moving somewhat in July, and then on January 1st of 2025, it moves again pretty significantly from that July number. So if you are lucky enough that no one is impacted in July, you still probably are going to need to look at this and decide what you want to do for January 1st. More than likely, if you're impacted in July, you're really going to be impacted by January. So, sort of keep that in the back of your mind and not just say, oh, we're fine for July, but have an organized plan around that for the January 1st one as well. Okay. Can you move the next slide? Or I
Oh,
can't.
sorry. Thanks.
That's all right. So again, there's really, if once you've come to the conclusion of what the job is based off of everything but this minimum salary, then you have two choices. If they fall below the minimum salary and they're exempt, you can increase their salary um, and keep them as the exempt position. So then you would have to make sure that everyone meets the minimum salary threshold that you're going to keep in that exempt classification. Some potential consequences we'll talk about on that is compression. And if you have any sort of certification or skill-based pay program, that should be thrown in there as a consideration as well. And we'll walk through that in a bit. Or the other thing you can do is you can reclassify these folks into non-exempt and make them eligible for overtime. So we'll walk through the two alternatives and what you need to consider for each of those. So these are just some examples. Our first one, currently exempt is making $45,000. We are looking at the January threshold. So we just kind of skipped over the July, but of course the July one you can do that in July as well as January, but we went ahead and looked at the January. So let's say someone's making $45,000. So it would be $13,656 to get them up to that new salary of $58,656. So that is a pretty big increase for someone. So you have to determine if that's something you want to do. Let's say you're estimating that they're working 5 hours a week of overtime, and then you would calculate that. Of course, you have to include the time and a half into that as well if they work those 5 extra hours of overtime, and that would put them an estimate of 53,438. So in this case, just purely off the numbers, you might want to look at this person as being a non-exempt employee. And then the second one, they were making a little bit more. They were much closer to that 58 at 52, and they're not working any overtime. So they might get some here or there, but let's just say, on average, they just don't work overtime. So, in that case, you'd be looking at the difference of leaving them at non-exempt at 52 or increasing their pay at $6,656. And then the last one here is one where they're making 48, but they're working kind of significant amount of overtime. And so the amount to threshold is $10,000 to keep them at exempt annually. But if you look at what the 10 hours will do at that time and a half, that would take them higher than that at 66. So you might want to consider in that case moving them to an exempt employee. Again, there are other considerations, but one thing you just first need to work through all the numbers and make sure you understand where you're at with each individual and each individual job. And then you can kind of know what the cost impact is going to be moving to each of the different alternatives.
One of the things you may want to put into place now too is we've estimated the number of hours of overtime each position works. It's going to be difficult in many organizations for you to even know in an exempt employee because you haven't had them track their hours before. So even asking that question right now, or maybe even doing a time study to understand how many hours of overtime an individual may work is really what you're going to need here in order to make these calculations work.
Yeah. And also an understanding of just because they're doing that now, that might be because they are exempt and they have the ability to accomplish the work in a longer amount of time and you're not paying for it. I mean, there's nothing to say that you can't tell folks that they can't work overtime, or if they need to work overtime, that at least is approved. So you have some basis for how much it's going to be. So again, if you were going to consider increasing their pay to remain exempt, I mean, this is a good alternative if they are truly an exempt level work and they're close. It's not going to cost you too much money to get people up to that amount. This is probably the least impactful as far as that goes. The two things you really need to consider in that scenario, though, are compression. That's the big one. So let's say you have accountant ones, and they're currently exempt, but most of them are making below the minimum threshold. And but you have accountant twos as well, and they are making above the threshold. They're not really someone you need to consider in this analysis, except for the fact that they're very close to that 58. So the maybe the minimum is 58. They're making $60,000, and now you're going to take this whole group of people right below them and push them up right into what they're making as far as pay. And so the cost then might be, some employee morale issues with those individuals. New hires are going to come in and make very close to them as well. And so the cost might not be just to move that group, but also do you have to move the group above them to make sure that they're not compressed together and have any issues with that. This one, the second point to consider, it's much less common, but if you were to do something where you say, oh, when you make it to accountant two, you get a certification. If you get a certain certification, whatever that may be, or if you achieve some sort of if you can now do these things, we will increase your pay. That's part of the promotion, and it goes into your actual pay. Those types of certification achievement increases could be wiped out. And so let's say you had someone came in, they made this amount, they got their certification, they gave them an increase to their pay, and so now they make this amount. Well, the people that come in could make the same as them and then have the opportunity to earn that certification award as well. So they will bypass the person who went through it earlier in the process. So just something to consider. Again, that's a much less used type of scenario, but those are the two things you would need to consider beyond the cost of what it takes to increase your employees to that threshold amount and to keep them exempt, but to look at the impact of other folks around them and what they're being paid, and if there's any cost adjustments there.
And Andrea, I know in working with our clients in the last couple of years, compression is the number one issue that we're seeing already.
It's already been an issue with new hires coming in and making at or more than the people that are currently in the position, just because of the way the market is right now with low unemployment and high inflation. Yeah, that would just be adding to it.
Right. So really even doing an FLSA analysis and potentially then overlaying that with a compression study, if we could get everything we wanted, if we had an unlimited budget, that's going to be the best right way to do this. All right. What if we don't necessarily want to keep them exempt? What if we're going to go ahead and classify them as non-exempt?
Okay. Well, I mean, obviously, hopefully you have at least one non-exempt employee in your organization. So when you reclassify them, you just need to make sure you understand what you need to do for record keeping and timekeeping so that they can report their time. Again, you don't have to take them to be hourly. You could have non-exempt salaried employees, but if you don't have those currently, there is some setup to something like that as well. The second consideration is employee morale. I think that the government feels like everyone's going to be cheering this on, and I'm sure will be a lot of people who would be, but folks that are currently exempt might look at this as a demotion. They now have to report their time. They have to request to work in addition to what it takes within a 40-hour work week to get it done. And you might have different policies for exempt and non-exempt, and that could have a negative impact to them around vacation or other different things that you might have within your organization.
Phase out, if you have policies that are exempt and non-exempt, my personal recommendation would be to phase those out quickly, because as the threshold continues to increase, it's only going to impact those policy changes.
Right. And then, of course, you need to make sure that they understand that, the required lunches and breaks are different than under an exempt. So the employee, again, might need to be educated if they've never been a non-exempt employee or haven't been in a while, that you can't just say, oh, I'm going to work through lunch and leave early, so that might not work as well as it had in the past for their particular how they work. But you need to make sure that they understand when they need to take breaks and lunches and those types of things. And then again, policies around travel can change if this job does travel and how that works, approval of your overtime, and then working outside. Of course, FLSA was developed, but even why they had to put in the computer exemption was because there weren't computers in 1938. The ability to work at home was not around in 1938. So there's a lot of considerations about, logging on after hours to your personal devices and working, um, and what the policies need to be around that. I'm sure you have that for a lot. So for other employees, but just then translating them to people who aren't used to using those types of policies currently.
When we've moved employees from exempt to non-exempt in the past, attorneys will recommend different things. And again, we are not attorneys here. But one of the things that I like to do is I've got a letter that really says, hey, you're moving from, because of the regulation changes, your role is moving from exempt to non-exempt, or even you are moving from an exempt to a non-exempt employee. This is the impact it may have on your pay. You're now eligible for overtime. This is exactly how you track your time, so you have it in writing. These are the policies that it affects. And in Kentucky, again, you've got to go into that required lunch break. So if the employee requests that they want to work through their lunch on a regular basis and they don't want that, then obviously there's additional documentation that you can complete there. But I think having a status change letter or an FLSA letter that walks through what the changes are for the employee helps improve transparency and what that looks like too. All right. Anybody having flashbacks now to 2019? This is probably the number one question that I have asked. For those of you who weren't around in HR in 2019, we've done this before. Not at this level, but this feels very much like what we did back then. And it actually was 2016. Sorry, we're working, and there was a new rule regulations that came out. We worked for 7 months on it. We did a lot of impact analysis on where we were going to move folks, and we implemented payroll systems, changed payroll systems, communicated to employees, to many of our clients, and then in the 11th hour, the ruling was overturned. So there was there were about 22 states that filed a lawsuit back in Sherman, Texas, and the Fifth Circuit actually stayed the appeal. And there wasn't a change back until 2019. So could this be overturned by the court? Sure. I will say I've asked this question just like you have to a number of employment law attorneys. I have yet to have one that really thinks that this will be fully overturned. I do think that this potentially, I do think that this will go through. Again, that's just my guesstimate. I'm going to be prepared for it. We're going to help make sure that our clients are prepared for it. Am I going to fully implement and roll it out before January 1? Nope. Learn that the hard way back in 2016. I think you really need to wait until right before you need to make that change, in the case that it does potentially get appealed. Andrea, anything on this? I know you've had some conversations too.
No, I mean, again, you could, right now, as we all know, it's a busy time in in the world, with politics and in the court systems and all of that. And I feel like I just don't see how the administration will, if at all possible, have that happen again. Like that was not something they wanted to happen, not only because of it being overturned, but because of just the timing of it. So I feel like with the whole 2-measure thing with July to set you up for January, like some folks are going to have to make some changes in July. And so that, I just don't see that not going through. So, it's just, I just feel like we're in a different place, and they've probably learned from the last time what they needed to do to make sure that didn't happen.
Right. Kim has asked us to go back up here to this slide. So we're gonna, while we work through questions, I'm gonna go back here to the minimum salary threshold to make sure you get this down. And then I've got a question in here from, oh, it's actually Kim who said, we have employees at the same management level, but their ranges are below and above the threshold. Do you have to change the entire group at the same time? And the answer is no. You actually aren't even required to change everybody in the same job at the same time, although administratively and not just administratively, but also for employee morale, that looks challenging when you have two employees in the same job and you know one of them makes below the threshold and one of them makes over. But the DOL actually regulates it by individual employee. So you do not have to change entire groupings at the same time. Most clients, from what we see, they actually change it at the job level, not at the employee level. So, a couple other questions. Could we get a copy of the slides? I don't know if we send out copies of the slides, but we certainly will put the recording on our website. So you can take the recording from the website and go through what we've shared today. Melissa said, with a chance of an overturn in the 11th hour, when would you recommend we communicate to staff? Should we send out communication in June or before? I do think you should communicate in June. If you really look at your payroll dates, you're going to have to communicate it in June. I think right now you can communicate that, hey, we saw that this regulation has come through. We're working on analyzing how this is going to impact our organization. And I think by early to mid-June, you do need to be communicating for that July 1 date what you're going to do. Again, you can always reference the law and say, because of the law, we are making these changes, or because of the change in regulation, this is what we're going to do. So if it does get overturned, it's an easy way to fall back on. That's exactly what Jennifer recommended too. So she said years ago, thankfully we used the wording because of the legal requirements and compliance, so it made it easier when that law was returned. So was repealed. Any other questions? I'm going to go over to this HCE. So again, here's the threshold levels for our highly comped employees. And I want to just reiterate one more time. We have a lot of employers that we've partnered with that may have jobs that don't necessarily meet the duties test, where they're not sure and they haven't truly done an in-depth analysis. This is your time. This is, as in many ways, this is going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging for businesses to meet this threshold, but this is also a gift for you to go back and say, because the law changed, we're now going to classify this role as non-exempt and talk about the salary test and the reclassification and analysis of the entire workforce. So this is almost a gift to go back and look at all of your employees and make sure that you've got it right, not just necessarily from the salary level, but also from a duties test as well. And then again, compression, you're going to have to stay on top of it from a comp perspective. I do think this is not just necessarily going to cause compression internally within your workforce, but this is going to have ramifications for compression for all jobs in the US and where things are moving. So it's going to be interesting to see where those entry-level exempt roles, where those salary levels come out in the next few years, because I think we're going to have some pretty significant market movement for our market-based pay structures for those entry-level roles. Any other last questions that I missed? Oh, go back to our contact information.
There was one.
Yeah, can you help me out, Chase? What is it?
Would you recommend we talk to exempt employees who would be impacted by the increase if they would have an issue with becoming non-exempt?
Only if you are willing to keep them as exempt and raise their threshold. To talk to them to say, do you have an issue with becoming non-exempt, when that's ultimately going to be the decision that you have to make anyway. I might rephrase that conversation to say, because of the regulations and the changes in the law, we as an organization are analyzing this and you're likely moving to non-exempt. And see what their reaction is and see if there are any things that you can do to alleviate what their frustration might be. But I certainly wouldn't ever give an employee a choice if they want to be exempt or non-exempt. In that case, you might as well just do what we call a salaried non-exempt. So that's paying somebody a salary, but also paying them time and a half for any overtime. And that can be pretty costly to an organization, but if you're truly worried about morale within your company, that could be a good way around it. You keep everybody salaried, but those folks who are non-exempt, who don't meet the threshold or the duties test, you also pay them time and a half for any hours that they work for overtime. And I'm sure we have a few people on this call that are doing that as well. All right. Christina wanted to see the HCE slide again. So I'm going to slide up here for our highly comp folks. All right, any other questions? I would encourage you to reach out to us, even if it's particular jobs that you want to talk through. Again, we are not attorneys, but we are much cheaper to have a conversation with typically than an attorney, and we work with a number of organizations, and it's likely that the role that you're talking about isn't that unique. We'd likely have a lot of others in the same situation, and we can always make a referral to an attorney if you really need to have a good conversation with someone. So on that, I will thank you all for joining us today. We'll stay tuned. If we hear anything else that comes out about these regulations or these changes, we'll certainly get another webinar out to you quickly. But thank you again for joining us. I'm going to scroll through here to the end. Contact us if you need anything, and we appreciate your time today.